The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Boston Harbor as Captain Thomas Preston adjusted his scarlet uniform, unaware that within hours, the very foundations of British authority in America would begin to crumble. It was April 19th, 1775, and the air itself seemed charged with rebellion. The seeds of what would become the Siege of Boston had been planted years earlier, when Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts in 1774. These punitive measures, designed to punish Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party, had instead united the colonies in unprecedented defiance. General Thomas Gage, the British military governor, found himself commanding a garrison surrounded by increasingly hostile colonists who viewed his redcoats not as protectors, but as occupiers. The spark that would ignite the siege came from an intelligence report that reached Gage's desk on the evening of April 18th. Colonial militias were stockpiling weapons and ammunition in Concord, a mere 20 miles from Boston. The general knew he had to act swiftly to prevent these supplies from falling into rebel hands. Under cover of darkness, he dispatched Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith with 700 men to march to Concord and destroy the military stores. As recorded in historical accounts from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the British column moved through the countryside with the confidence of a professional army facing amateur militia. They had no idea that Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott had already ridden through the night, warning every village and farmer the approaching danger. The countryside was awakening to the sound of church bells and signal guns at Lexington Green as the first pale light of dawn broke across the Massachusetts landscape. Captain John Parker assembled his company of Minutemen. These were not professional soldiers, but farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants who had drilled on village greens for months, preparing for this moment. Parker's famous words, "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here," would echo through history. The confrontation lasted mere minutes, but those minutes changed everything. When British Major John Pitcairn ordered the colonials to disperse, someone fired a shot that would be heard around the world. 8 colonists lay dead on Lexington Green, and the die was cast. The British column pressed onto Concord, where they found most of the military supplies already removed. At North Bridge, they encountered determined resistance from colonial militia companies that had converged from surrounding towns. The retreat from Concord became a nightmare for the British forces. Colonial militiamen, employing tactics learned from fighting Native Americans, harassed the redcoats from behind stone walls, trees, and buildings. The disciplined European-style formations that had served Britain so well in previous wars proved vulnerable to this unconventional warfare. By the time the exhausted British reached the safety of Boston, they had suffered 273 casualties. More importantly, they found themselves trapped. Within days of the Lexington and Concord battles, thousands of colonial militia companies arrived from across New England. These men, carrying hunting rifles and farming tools turned weapons, established a loose siege line around Boston. The British, masters of the world's seas, suddenly found themselves prisoners on a peninsula, dependent on naval supply lines for their very survival. The stage was set for what would become an 11-month siege that would test the resolve of both sides and ultimately prove that the American colonists possessed both the will and the ability to challenge the mighty British Empire. The amateur soldiers gathering in the hills around Boston were about to face their greatest test. The weeks following Lexington and Concord transformed the Massachusetts countryside into an armed camp. Colonel William Prescott surveyed the growing encampment from his position on Cambridge Common, watching as men from across New England continued to arrive with whatever weapons they could carry. By early May 1775, nearly 15,000 colonial militia had surrounded Boston, creating one of the largest military gatherings in American history. Inside Boston, General Gage found himself in an increasingly precarious position. His garrison of 4,000 regulars controlled the city and its harbor, but they were effectively cut off from the surrounding countryside. Every supply of food, fuel, and fodder had to come by ship from Britain or other loyal colonies. The general's correspondence with London, as documented in British military archives, reveals his growing concern about the determination and organization of the colonial forces surrounding him. The colonial forces faced their own challenges. Unlike the disciplined British regulars, the militia companies came from different colonies with varying levels of training and equipment. Command structure was unclear, with Massachusetts appointing Artemas Ward as overall commander, while Connecticut and Rhode Island maintained their own command hierarchies. The men lived in hastily constructed camps that lacked proper sanitation, and disease began to spread rapidly through the ranks. Despite these challenges, the colonials demonstrated remarkable ingenuity in establishing their siege. They constructed earthworks and fortifications using techniques learned from military manuals and adapted to local conditions. The siege lines stretched from the Mystic River in the north to Dorchester Heights in the south, effectively sealing off Boston by land. Naval vessels could still reach the harbor, but even these faced harassment from colonial artillery positioned at strategic points along the coast. The arrival of Benedict Arnold in Cambridge marked a significant development in the siege. Arnold, a Connecticut militia colonel with extensive military experience, proposed a daring plan to capture Fort Ticonderoga in New York. This fortress controlled access to Lake Champlain and contained valuable artillery that could strengthen the siege of Boston. Working in conjunction with Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys, Arnold succeeded in capturing Ticonderoga on May 10, 1775, securing dozens of cannons that would prove crucial in the months ahead. Meanwhile, the political situation continued to evolve. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia on May 10. The same day Ticonderoga fell, the delegates faced the monumental task of coordinating resistance across 13 separate colonies while maintaining the fiction that they sought reconciliation with Britain rather than independence. The appointment of George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army on June 15th would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions in American history. As spring turned to summer, both sides prepared for what seemed an inevitable escalation. General Gage received reinforcements, including Generals William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne, bringing British strength in Boston to over 6,000 men. These were experienced officers who had served in Europe and were confident they could quickly disperse the colonial militia with a decisive show of force. The colonials, sensing that a major confrontation was approaching, worked frantically to improve their positions. They established supply lines reaching back into the interior, organized military hospitals, and attempted to impose discipline on their diverse force. The Committee of Safety, led by men like Joseph Warren and Samuel Adams, coordinated intelligence gathering and strategic planning. By mid-June, the siege had settled into a tense stalemate. British ships controlled the harbor, while colonial forces controlled the surrounding countryside. Neither side could deliver a decisive blow, but everyone understood that this situation could not continue indefinitely. The approaching summer heat would make conditions in both the besieged city and the surrounding camps increasingly unbearable, creating pressure for decisive action that would soon explode into the bloodiest battle yet fought on American soil. The pre-dawn darkness of June 17, 1775, concealed one of the most audacious military operations in colonial American history. Colonel William Prescott led approximately 1,000 Massachusetts and Connecticut militia silently across Charlestown Neck, their destination the strategic heights overlooking Boston Harbor. What happened next would transform a colonial rebellion into a continental revolution. The decision to fortify Breed's Hill had emerged from heated debates in the colonial war councils. Originally, the plan called for fortifying Bunker Hill, which commanded the northern approaches to Boston. However, when Prescott and his men reached the Charlestown Peninsula in the pre-dawn hours, they chose the lower, but more exposed Breed's Hill, which offered a more direct threat to British positions in Boston. This decision, whether made from tactical insight or confusion in the darkness, would prove both brilliant and costly. Working by moonlight and then the first pale rays of dawn, the colonials constructed an earthwork redoubt approximately 130 feet long. The men worked with desperate intensity, knowing that daybreak would reveal their position to British observers across the harbor. By sunrise, they had created a formidable fortification that commanded the harbor and directly threatened British ships anchored below. The British response was swift and overwhelming. General Thomas Gage, awakened by reports of the overnight construction, immediately recognized the threat. From his headquarters in Boston, he could see colonial artillery, positions that could potentially sink British ships in the harbor or bombard the city itself, as documented in military dispatches preserved in the British National Archives. Gage ordered an immediate assault to retake the heights before the colonial position could be further strengthened. General William Howe received command of the assault. Forced the veteran of European campaigns, Howe was confident that disciplined British regulars could easily sweep aside colonial militia. He assembled over 2,000 men, including light infantry, grenadiers, and regular line companies. The plan was straightforward: land on the Charlestown Peninsula, form battle lines, and advance up the hill with bayonets fixed, overwhelming the amateur colonial defenders through superior discipline and firepower. The colonial defenders faced a desperate situation. They had worked through the night and now faced a vastly superior force with limited ammunition and no clear retreat route. Joseph Warren, president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, arrived to fight as a volunteer, inspiring the men with his presence. The famous words attributed to either Prescott or Israel Putnam, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," reflected both the colonials' limited ammunition and their understanding that disciplined volley fire was their only hope against the advancing professionals. At approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Howe's forces began their advance up Breed's Hill. The British soldiers, carrying full packs in the summer heat, moved in perfect formation across the rough terrain. The colonials, hidden behind their earthworks, watched with growing tension as the scarlet lines approached. When the range closed to 50 yards, the colonial militia unleashed a devastating volley that shattered the leading British ranks. The first British assault collapsed in confusion and casualties. Officers fell at an alarming rate as colonial marksmen, many of them experienced hunters, picked off the most visible targets. Howe regrouped his forces and ordered a second assault, this time concentrating his attack on the colonial left flank, where the fortifications were weakest. Again, disciplined colonial fire broke the British advance, leaving the slopes littered with casualties. The third assault succeeded only because the colonials had exhausted their ammunition. As British bayonets finally reached the colonial positions, hand-to-hand fighting erupted across the fortifications. Joseph Warren fell with a musket ball to the head, becoming one of the first martyrs of the Revolution. The colonials, facing overwhelming numbers and lacking bayonets for close combat, began an organized withdrawal across Charlestown Neck. The Battle of Bunker Hill, as it became known despite being fought primarily on Breed's Hill, ended in technical British victory but strategic colonial triumph. The British suffered over 1,000 casualties, including many officers, while colonial losses numbered around 400. More importantly, the colonial militia had proven they could stand against professional European troops, transforming what many had viewed as a local Massachusetts rebellion into a continental war for independence. The smoke had barely cleared from Bunker Hill when George Washington arrived in Cambridge on July 3, 1775, to assume command of what Congress had optimistically named the Continental Army. The Virginia planter surveyed his new command with the calculating eye of an experienced military officer and found a situation that would have daunted a lesser man. What he discovered was not an army, but a collection of militia companies held together by little more than shared resentment of British rule. Washington's initial assessment, recorded in his letters to Congress and preserved in the Library of Congress archives, revealed the magnitude of his challenge. The men were undisciplined, poorly equipped, and lacking in basic military knowledge. Many had enlisted for short terms and planned to return home for harvest season. Sanitation in the camps was appalling, with disease spreading rapidly through units that had no understanding of military hygiene. Perhaps most critically, the various colonial contingents maintained their separate identities and command structures, creating a fractured coalition rather than a unified force. The new commander-in-chief brought both advantages and disadvantages to his position. His experience in the French and Indian War had taught him the realities of military campaigning, but it had also shown him the limitations of colonial forces against professional European armies. His Virginia background initially created suspicion among New England troops who wondered why a Southerner had been chosen to lead what they saw as their fight. However, Washington's imposing physical presence, careful attention to military protocol, and obvious dedication to the cause gradually won respect from his officers and men. One of Washington's first priorities was establishing a proper command structure. He retained several competent New England officers, including Artemas Ward and Israel Putnam, while bringing in additional leaders from other colonies. The appointment of Nathanael Greene as a brigadier general proved particularly fortunate, as the Rhode Island Quaker possessed both tactical ability and organizational skills that would prove invaluable throughout the war. Charles Lee, a former British officer with extensive European experience, provided professional military knowledge despite his difficult personality. The challenge of supply proved as daunting as issues of command and discipline. The siege lines required constant provisioning with food, ammunition, and equipment, but Congress possessed limited funds and no established supply system. Washington found himself simultaneously commanding troops, negotiating with civilian authorities, and improvising solutions to logistical problems that would have challenged experienced quartermasters. The arrival of captured artillery from Fort Ticonderoga provided a boost to morale, but moving the heavy guns from New York to Massachusetts required ingenuity and determination. That exemplified the colonial war effort. Inside Boston, the British faced their own mounting difficulties. General Gage found himself criticized by both his superiors in London and his subordinates in Boston for his handling of the situation. The casualties from Bunker Hill had shaken confidence in British tactical superiority, while the continuing siege demonstrated that the colonials possessed both the will and ability to sustain organized resistance. Civilian loyalists in Boston began to question whether British protection was worth the hardships of living in a besieged city. The summer and fall of 1775 witnessed a gradual transformation of both forces. Washington instituted regular drill, improved camp sanitation, and began the long process of creating military discipline among men who had never known anything but civilian life. He faced constant challenges from soldiers whose enlistments were expiring and who saw no compelling reason to continue serving when their farms needed attention. The commander's correspondence reveals his frustration with men who would go home, be the consequences what it may. Meanwhile, the British government was coming to terms with the reality that this was no longer a local disturbance, but a full-scale rebellion requiring massive military resources to suppress. The appointment of William Howe to replace Gage as commander-in-chief reflected London's recognition that the situation required more aggressive leadership. However, Howe inherited the same fundamental problem, a garrison trapped in an increasingly untenable position with supply lines stretched across 3,000 miles of ocean. As autumn turned to winter, both armies settled into what appeared to be a permanent stalemate. The British controlled Boston and its harbor, but could venture nowhere else in Massachusetts. The colonials controlled everything beyond Boston Neck, but lacked the strength to storm the city's fortifications. This uneasy balance would continue until a young artillery officer named Henry Knox proposed a plan so audacious that it would break the deadlock and force the British to abandon their last stronghold in New England. The winter of 1775 brought unprecedented challenges to both armies locked in the Boston siege, but it also created an opportunity that would change the course of the Revolution. In the colonial camp at Cambridge, a 25-year-old artillery colonel named Henry Knox approached George Washington with a proposal that seemed to border on madness: transport the captured cannons from Fort Ticonderoga across 300 miles of wilderness in the dead of winter to break the siege of Boston. Knox's plan emerged from his understanding that the siege had reached an impasse. The colonial forces lacked the heavy artillery necessary to bombard British positions effectively, while the British garrison, though well supplied by sea, could not venture beyond Boston without facing the entire Continental Army. The artillery captured at Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point included dozens of cannons, mortars, and howitzers that could provide the firepower needed to make British positions untenable. The challenge lay in moving these massive weapons across mountains, rivers, and forests in the worst season of the year. Washington's decision to approve Knox's expedition demonstrated both his desperation to break the stalemate and his ability to recognize opportunity in seemingly impossible circumstances. As documented in correspondence housed at Mount Vernon, the commander-in-chief understood that the siege could not continue indefinitely. Colonial enlistments were expiring, public support was wavering, and the approaching spring would bring British reinforcements that could overwhelm his position. The artillery from Ticonderoga represented perhaps the only hope of achieving a decisive victory before the Revolution collapsed from internal pressures. Knox departed Cambridge in November 1775 with a small party of men and a seemingly impossible mission. The young colonel, a former Boston bookseller who had educated himself in military engineering through voracious reading, possessed the combination of theoretical knowledge and practical determination necessary for such an undertaking. His route would take him through the Berkshire Mountains, across the Hudson River, and through the wilderness of New York's North Country to the captured British fortresses on Lake Champlain. The logistics of the expedition tested every aspect of colonial ingenuity and determination. Knox and his men had to construct special sleds capable of carrying cannons, weighing several tons each. They negotiated with local farmers and woodsmen for oxen, horses, and equipment, often paying with continental currency of dubious value. The expedition required the cooperation of multiple colonial governments. As it passed through Massachusetts, New York, and the disputed territory that would become Vermont, the journey itself became an epic of endurance and determination. Knox's detailed journal, preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society, documents the daily struggles against weather, terrain, and equipment failure. River crossings proved particularly hazardous, as the weight of the artillery repeatedly broke through ice that appeared solid. On multiple occasions, cannons crashed through frozen surfaces and had to be retrieved from icy waters by men working in conditions that would have defeated less determined soldiers. The human cost of the expedition was severe, but not insurmountable. Men suffered from frostbite, exhaustion, and injuries caused by handling heavy equipment in treacherous conditions. Several oxen died from overwork, forcing the expedition to abandon some equipment and consolidate loads. Local communities along the route provided crucial support, offering food, shelter, and replacement animals. Though not always willingly and sometimes only after negotiations that consumed precious time, the most dangerous moment came during the crossing of the Hudson River near Albany. The ice appeared solid, but the weight of the heaviest cannons created an immediate crisis. When several pieces broke through and threatened to disappear forever into the dark water below, Knox and his men worked through the night in sub-zero temperatures using ropes, pulleys, and sheer determination to retrieve the artillery. This incident, which could have ended the entire expedition, instead demonstrated the extraordinary commitment that would characterize the colonial war effort. Throughout the Revolution. By January 1776, Knox's noble train of artillery was approaching the final stages of its journey. The cannons that had been captured in a surprise assault on a British fortress were about to be turned against British forces besieged in Boston. The success of this seemingly impossible expedition would provide Washington with the means to break the siege, but it would also demonstrate to both sides that the colonial cause possessed resources of determination and ingenuity that could overcome even the most daunting obstacles. The stage was set for the final act of the siege that had already transformed 13 separate colonies into a united nation in arms. The first week of March 1776 found General Washington studying the hills south of Boston with the intensity of a chess master contemplating a decisive move. Dorchester Heights commanded the southern approaches to Boston Harbor, and Washington knew that artillery position there could make the British position untenable. The successful arrival of Henry Knox's cannons from Ticonderoga had provided the means. Now the challenge was to fortify the heights without alerting the British garrison to the operation, until it was too late to prevent. The plan that emerged from Washington's war council was audacious in its simplicity and breathtaking in its risk. On the night of March 4th, 1776, colonial forces would simultaneously conduct a diversionary bombardment from existing positions, while secretly moving men and artillery onto Dorchester Heights. The operation required perfect coordination, absolute silence during the crucial phases, and the kind of luck that had sustained the colonial cause through 18 months of rebellion. Preparation for the assault consumed weeks of careful planning. General John Thomas, a Massachusetts physician-turned-soldier, received command of the operation with explicit instructions to fortify the heights. Before dawn revealed the colonial presence to British observers, the plan called for pre-construction of wooden frames that could be quickly assembled into fortifications. Since the frozen ground made traditional earthwork construction impossible, barrels filled with earth and stones would provide additional protection and could be rolled down the hillside to break up any British assault. The diversionary bombardment began at sunset on March 4th, with colonial artillery from Cambridge and Roxbury opening fire on British positions in Boston. This bombardment, while causing minimal damage due to the range and limited ammunition available, achieved its primary purpose of focusing British attention away from Dorchester Heights. British return fire was vigorous but ineffective, as documented in British military records that describe the frustration of gunners unable to reach their tormentors. Under cover of this artillery duel, Thomas led approximately 1,000 men across Boston Neck and up the slopes of Dorchester Heights. The men carried everything needed for the fortification: pre-constructed wooden frames, tools, barrels of earth, and the precious artillery pieces that Knox had brought from Ticonderoga. Working in shifts to minimize noise, they began construction of what would become one of the most important fortifications in American military history. The night's work proceeded with remarkable efficiency despite the enormous challenges. Men worked in teams, some assembling the wooden fortifications while others positioned artillery and constructed secondary defensive works. The frozen ground that had initially seemed an obstacle proved beneficial in some ways, as it provided a solid foundation for the heavy cannons and prevented the muddy conditions that would have made movement impossible in other seasons. Dawn on March 5th revealed to astonished British observers a fully fortified colonial position commanding Boston Harbor. General William Howe, who had replaced Gage as British commander, immediately grasped the implications of the overnight transformation. Colonial artillery on Dorchester Heights could bombard British ships in the harbor and make the city itself untenable for military occupation. In his dispatch to London, preserved in British military archives, Howe wrote that the colonial works must have been the employment of at least 12,000 men. The British response was swift, but ultimately unsuccessful. Howe ordered an immediate assault on the heights, recognizing that delay would only strengthen the colonial position. However, a violent storm struck Boston Harbor just as British landing craft were preparing to cross the water, forcing postponement of the attack. This delay proved fatal to British hopes, as it allowed the colonials to further strengthen their positions and bring additional artillery to bear on the harbor. By March 7th, the strategic situation had become untenable for the British. Colonial artillery on Dorchester Heights commanded both the harbor and the city, making it impossible for British ships to remain safely at anchor or for the garrison to maintain its position. The fortification of Dorchester Heights had achieved in 3 days what 18 months of siege had failed to accomplish. It had made Boston indefensible for British forces. Howe faced a decision that would determine the future of British strategy. In America, he could attempt a costly assault on heavily fortified positions defended by artillery and thousands of determined colonials, or he could abandon Boston and seek more favorable ground elsewhere. The casualties from Bunker Hill had demonstrated the price of frontal assaults against prepared colonial positions, while the success of the Dorchester Heights operation showed that the colonials possessed both the tactical skill and strategic vision necessary to sustain their rebellion. The stage was set for the final act of the siege that had transformed a colonial rebellion into a continental revolution. The morning of March 17th, 1776, dawned clear and cold over Boston Harbor as the last British transport ships prepared to depart, ending an occupation that had lasted 8 years and a siege that had endured 11 months. From the ramparts of Dorchester Heights, George Washington watched through his spyglass as the scarlet uniforms of British regulars filed aboard the vessels that would carry them away from New England forever. The siege of Boston was over, and with it, the last British stronghold in the birthplace of American resistance had fallen to colonial arms. The British evacuation had begun in earnest following Howe's recognition that Dorchester Heights made Boston indefensible, rather than attempt a costly assault that would likely fail at enormous human cost. The British commander chose strategic withdrawal to preserve his forces for future operations. This decision, while militarily sound, carried profound political implications that resonated throughout the British Empire and colonial America. For the first time in the conflict, British forces were retreating from colonial territory, abandoning not just a city, but the symbolic heart of royal authority in America. The logistical challenges of evacuating Boston tested British organizational capabilities to their limits. Over 9,000 soldiers, 1,000 loyalist civilians, and enormous quantities of military supplies had to be loaded aboard ships, while under potential threat from colonial artillery. As documented in British military correspondence, the evacuation required careful coordination between Army and Navy officers, who had often worked at cross purposes during the siege. Personal belongings, military equipment, and even furniture from occupied homes had to be sorted, packed, and loaded under time pressure that increased daily as colonial positions grew stronger. For the loyalist civilians who chose exile over submission to rebel authority, the evacuation represented personal tragedy on an enormous scale. Families that had lived in Massachusetts for generations found themselves forced to choose between their property and their political beliefs. Many loyalists would never return to America, beginning a diaspora that scattered British sympathizers across the empire from Nova Scotia to the Caribbean. Their departure removed a significant source of intelligence and local support that the British would sorely miss in future operations. Washington's decision to allow the British evacuation without harassment demonstrated both tactical wisdom and political maturity that would characterize his leadership throughout the war. Rather than risk costly attacks on departing enemies, he focused on consolidating American control over Boston and preparing for future British offensives elsewhere. The commander's correspondence reveals his understanding that the siege's successful conclusion provided an opportunity to strengthen colonial morale and international credibility that might prove more valuable than tactical victories achieved at high cost. The colonial occupation of Boston began immediately following the British departure. Washington's forces marched into the city to scenes of jubilation from residents who had endured months of military occupation. However, the celebration was tempered by the enormous challenges that remained. Boston had been damaged by military occupation and the siege itself, with many buildings showing the effects of artillery bombardment and neglect. The harbor was filled with obstacles and debris that would require months to clear. The strategic implications of Boston's liberation extended far beyond Massachusetts. The successful siege demonstrated that colonial forces could not only resist British military power, but could actually force the evacuation of established British positions. This achievement provided enormous encouragement to resistance movements throughout the colonies while simultaneously shocking British political and military leadership. The amateur soldiers who had surrounded Boston with hunting rifles and farm tools had achieved what many believed impossible. They had defeated the professional army of the world's greatest military power. The siege of Boston had also created the Continental Army as an effective fighting force. The men who marched into Boston in March 1776 bore little resemblance to the militia companies that had first surrounded the city following Lexington and Concord. Months of siege warfare had taught them discipline, coordination, and the complex skills necessary for sustained military operations. Officers like Nathanael Greene, Henry Knox, and Benedict Arnold had gained invaluable experience that would serve them throughout the coming war. Perhaps most importantly, the siege had demonstrated that the American colonies possessed the political will and organizational capability necessary to sustain a prolonged conflict with Britain. The successful coordination of forces from multiple colonies, the development of supply systems that could support thousands of soldiers for nearly a year, and the political leadership that maintained civilian support throughout the siege all proved that American independence was not merely a slogan, but an achievable goal. As Washington established his headquarters in Boston and began planning for the campaigns that everyone knew must come, he could look back on the siege as the crucible in which both he and the Continental Army had been forged. The amateur general who had arrived in Cambridge had become a proven military commander, while the collection of militia companies he had inherited had become the foundation of American military independence. The siege of Boston was over, but the revolution it had made possible was just beginning. Historical references and authenticity note, this narrative draws upon extensive documentation from the Massachusetts Historical Society, British National Archives, Library of Congress manuscript collections, and Mount Vernon's Washington Papers Project, ensuring historical accuracy while maintaining engaging storytelling throughout this pivotal period in American history.